All right, in this video, we will be going through chapter 6, which is all about the integumentary system. And we're going to start with chapter 6.1 and 6.2 in this video. And then I'll have a follow-up video with 6.3, 4, and 5. So just as an introduction into the integumentary system, it is an organ system, so it does have organs. And remember back from chapter 1 that an organ is made up of many different tissues that have specific functions. And the skin itself is an organ. If you go by weight, it is the single largest organ in our body. A lot of people, when they think, what's the biggest organ, they think the brain, but it's actually the skin because it covers you entirely from head to toe. Sometimes the skin is also called the integument. There are other organs in addition to the skin. We call those accessory organs or accessory structures. So these would be your hair, fingernails and toenails, and then all of the different glands and receptors within the skin. And its main function is to act as a barrier. So the skin is what separates you from not you. Everything outside of the skin is not you, and the skin is also protecting you from outside forces. Okay, now the skin technically has two main layers, but we always include a third layer with it called the hypodermis, but this is actually not a part of the skin. You do need to know these two main layers, the hypodermis that lies under the skin, and then as we go forward in the slides, you'll need to know the individual layers that make up these main layers. So the outermost layer, the most superficial, is called the epidermis. Whenever you see that suffix derm, or that root word derm, that means it will have to do with skin. So the epidermis is the very outermost layer, and it is made of stratified squamous epithelial tissue. You do need to note that. Then if you're moving deep, more towards the inside of the body, the next major layer is the dermis. It is much, much thicker, and it's mostly made of connective tissue, but it also contains blood vessels, some smooth muscle in the form of the erector papillae muscles, and also nervous tissues. Your skin is actually quite sensitive to hot and cold, but also to pressure, both deep pressure and a light pressure, touch, as well as pain. And it's quite discriminatory in its abilities. And by that, I mean that we can, especially in our palms, we can sense, down to 1/10 of a degree temperature difference. There is a basement membrane underneath the epidermis that kind of separates the dermis. So that stratified squamous epithelial tissue, still follows all the characteristics of that tissue we learned in chapter 5. Deep to the dermis is a layer called the hypodermis. So hypo means below. So this is a layer that's made of adipose tissue and as well as areolar tissue. The adipose tissue can increase or decrease depending on how much body fat a person has, and also their growth stage in life. Children tend to be a little bit leaner because they're using up all their energy to grow. And women tend to have a little bit more adipose tissue than men in general, which is why women's skin feels softer than a man's because they have that extra adipose layer. The hypodermis, it functions to connect the skin to the underlying tissues of mostly muscle tissue or bone, but it is not technically skin, okay? The adipose tissue helps to insulate the body, regulates body temperature. So the more adipose tissue a person has, the easier it is for them to retain heat, which is an advantage in colder climates. But in a warmer climate, like here in Florida, it can be a disadvantage. So people who have a lot of adipose tissue can be at danger for heat stroke if they cannot get cooled down outside. And then the hypodermis is also where the bulk of the blood vessels originate. the very outermost layer, if you remember back in chapter 5, the stratified squamous epithelium is avascular. So it does not have any blood directly feeding it. So the outer layers of the epidermis are dead cells. Okay, and then here's a picture. On the left is a more stylized cartoonish drawing, and on the right is a cross section of actual skin. Now, actual skin isn't colored like this. We stain it so that it's more visible to the naked eye. In reality, it's mostly clear and kind of grayish looking. You should be able to label this picture. We will have some practices with this, but basically this peel away. Let me grab the laser pointer. So this peel away part right here, this is the epidermis. You can see the boundary has these little bumps on it, and then this portion in the middle is the dermis, and then at the very bottom is the hypodermis, and you can see it looks like little blobs of fat. Okay, that's the adipose tissue. You have a hair with its accessory structures here. It has glands linked to it. Here's the erector pili muscle. There's a sweat gland with its accompanying duct. The blood vessels are here, the red and the blue. The yellow are nerves. We're going to see that a lot as we go through these units. That's standard in anatomy. Red is for arteries and arterioles, blue is for veins and venules, and then yellow we typically use either for lymph vessels or nerves, and in this case it's nerves. Okay. So the epidermis, like I said, it's made of stratified squamous epithelial and it has no blood vessels. There are 5 layers total, but the 5th layer is only found in the skin of the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet. So it's only in thick skin. You do need to know these 5 layers. So starting at the deepest, the innermost layer is the stratum basale, or sometimes it's called stratum germinativum. Basale for basal or base layer. Germinativum is the same word as the word germinate, which means to grow. So this is the deepest layer. It is a single layer of cells, but they all can go through mitosis, cell division, okay? And it's this germinativum that regenerates the skin because the skin on the outside of the body, the most superficial skin, has actually died and it needs to be continually replaced. So the stratum basale is actually the one that's closest to blood vessels. It sits right above them. The blood vessels are located in the dermis, so it has access to oxygen and nutrients so that it can go through cell division. The older cells, when it divides, the older cells get pushed outwards, more superficial, and they do have a lifespan basically, and they change in size and shape. They're heavily keratinized. They have a protein called keratin that's made by the cells. They're called keratinocytes. Cyte means cell, C-Y-T-E. And they become harder and harder and flatter as the cells travel upwards through these layers. So a single cell, if you follow it, does actually start in the stratum basale, and then it moves its way upwards through these 4 or 5 layers if it's on the hands or the feet. Okay, the next layers in order from deepest to most superficial is the stratum spinosum, the stratum granulosum, the stratum corneum, and the stratum lucidum. Sorry, the corneum is the outermost layer. The lucidum would come between granulosum and corneum, but only when it's actually present. Stratum means layer. It's just Latin. So stratum, strata, it's just layer. Basal is for base. Spinosum means spiny. Granulosum means granule, and corneum means corny or hard, basically. And they're named for what it looks like under the microscope, basically, as the cell changes, as it works its way through the epidermis. And the epidermis protects the body against mechanical injury, which would be like physically getting a hit. Like if you stubbed your toe on something, the skin protects the underlying tissues. If you didn't have a layer of skin and you stubbed your toe, it would be quite painful because all your nerve endings would be exposed. The skin also helps us to not dehydrate. Everything inside has to stay warm and wet in order for all chemical processes in the body to function. So if you did not have the skin, you would desiccate, is what that's called. You would dry out and eventually die, which is why burn victims have to have particular care taken of their burns, because the tissue underneath where the skin has burned off can be quite damaged, and you can have a worse injury if it's not properly cared for. The epidermis also protects against any chemicals from the outside world, and it helps your immune system by physically blocking bacteria or viruses or fungus or any pathogens from getting inside the body. And here's a picture again. On the left is more stylized, and on the right is what it actually looks like. So you can see these cells are closely packed together. The darker purple here, that's the epidermis. The lighter pink color, that's the dermis. Okay, and you can see each individual cell, and then the little darker blobs in the middle, those are the nuclei of each cell. And you see at the bottom, the cells are a little bit bigger, rounder, but at the very top layer, you see that unique squamous shape like we learned about in the last chapter. Now, the epidermis contains special cells that are found throughout the stratified squamous epithelial tissue. And these special cells are called melanocytes. So again, CYTE means cell, and then the cells are typically named for what they produce or what they do. So in this case, melano means these cells produce melanin, which is a pigment. It's a colored molecule that is what gives the skin its color. So you find the melanocytes in the deepest layer of the epidermis, and also some in the dermis. So they're going to be in that stratum basale layer and then underneath in the dermis. And the job of melanin is to protect our self, basically, from the harmful effects of UV radiation, ultraviolet radiation from the sun. Melanin is a natural sunscreen, basically. The problem is UV radiation is a high energy light, and it's high enough energy that it can directly interact with the DNA that's in our cells and cause mutations in that DNA. And over a long enough time, if you say are constantly getting sunburned, that's the first step, sunburn, so you physically can get hurt from the sun. Over time, those mutations will accumulate and can lead to cancers, skin cancers, which would be your melanoma is the really scary one, but there's also basal cell carcinomas and a few other skin cancers. Those typically aren't as big of a deal. You just go to a dermatologist and they freeze them off or laser them out. But the melanoma is very serious and can be deadly. So the melanin is there to protect for that, and that's also why when you spend more time in the sun, your skin gets darker. Like everyone, unless they're an albino, can get a suntan. Even if you're dark skinned to begin with, you can your body can produce even more melanin, and you can become darker. And the reverse is true too. If you spend a lot of time away from the sunlight, you'll get lighter in skin color. The melanin is a pigment that's in the skin and also in the hair, and it's the same thing that gives the hair its color. The more melanin, the darker the color. Less melanin, the lighter the color. And there are two different versions of melanin. At the bottom here, there's eumelanin. EU is a prefix that means true. So there's true melanin, and that's that brownish black pigment. And then there's also pheomelanin, which is more of a reddish yellow. So like you find this in your lips. The melanin is made within the cell of the melanocyte. And that melanocyte then secretes, basically it ejects the melanin pigments outside of its cell membrane. and it will go into the surrounding cells of the epidermis. And the process of doing that is called cytokine secretion. And the other cells will take in that pigment and hold it within themselves. This process is also part of why tattoos work. The other cells of the epidermis just naturally take up this melanin within them. So when a tattoo is made, the ink pigments is injected far enough down that the surrounding cells pick it up, confusing it for melanin, but they'll hold it there. And here's an example. So this over here, this is a melanocyte, okay? And within it, it has a special organelle called a melanosome. Okay, real clever naming, right? Okay, and all these organelles do is just make tons and tons of this pigment. This picture is kind of zoomed in for here. Here's the melanocyte. All this kind of pinkish purpley area here is part of the melanocyte still, okay? It has these kind of pseudopod-like extensions that go out and in between all the cells in the epidermis, these stratified squamous epithelial cells, okay? And then the little dots are the melanocytes, and they get ejected, and then the surrounding cells will take that melanin in and become darker. So everyone is born with mostly the same number of melanocytes. So if you're very dark skinned, you don't have, on average, more melanocytes than someone who's very light skinned. Okay, that's kind of a set thing in humans. We all, on average, have about the same. Okay, but what causes the difference in skin color is genetics. There are several genes involved. It's not just one gene. And there are also multiple different alleles, if you remember back to first year biology. So you can have two versions of a gene is what you learn in first year biology. You have a dominant and a recessive version. But it turns out with skin color, there's 3, sometimes more different versions of these alleles. So I think at last count, I remember reading about 5 different ones for skin color, 5 different genes, and then 3 different alleles. So if you were to do the math, you wind up with a lot of different combinations that you can get in skin color. So even if you're siblings, if your parents have, genetic variety that gets passed on to you, you and your siblings can have a range. So skin color is actually on a spectrum from the, the lightest white to the darkest dark, and everything in between. And it can happen. There are many instances, you can just Google them, where you have fraternal twins, not identical, but fraternal twins who are born to mixed race parents, where one twin is born white and one twin is born black. It can just happen. It's kind of an interesting genetics problem, I guess, to figure out like how that happens. But it doesn't matter if you're born from the same womb. Fraternal twins are no more alike than other siblings. But yeah, so there's a full range of colors that can happen. It's more like a dimmer switch than a off-on switch. Now, those skin colors can be influenced as well by environmental factors. I already talked about the sun. So you can't go from being the darkest skinned person to a lightest skinned person if you just stay away from the sun. The skin will get a little bit lighter, or the lightest skinned person can't go to the darkest skin color just by being in the sun. Okay, they'll get sunburned when that happens. But there is a little leeway. And then there are a few physiological factors that can affect skin color that we're going to talk about coming up. So aside from the melanin, your skin also should have a reddish or a pinkish hue that comes from the blood supply that is found in the dermis and the hypodermis. All blood is red, even if it's coming from a vein, it's red. and it's a brighter, more vivid red if there's oxygen in that blood, and that is what you should see in a healthy person who has a high, oxygen concentration level in their blood. You should see a pinkish color. If you have darker skin, this can be a little bit difficult to see the pinkish color, but you can see it in the fingernails, no matter your skin color, or on the palms of your hand where it's a little bit lighter. So you can just yourself just do a little experiment. So if you have your fingernail, look at it, and you should see that it's pink, hopefully. Push down on it with another finger, and then let it go. And what you should see when you push down on it, you've pushed all the blood out of the way temporarily, and when you let go, you'll see it's whiter, and then you'll see the blood rush back in, and you should see the pink come back. You can also see that on the palm of your hand. That's why it's been in the news a lot lately with COVID, and why people have those little gadgets on their fingers when they go to the doctor that's measuring your blood oxygen concentration. And it does so by shining a little light through your fingernail to determine how red or how pink your skin is under that fingernail. And that's what tells you. You should be like 98 or 99 or 100%. Poorly oxygenated blood or poorly oxygenated tissues will look blue from outside. Now the blood itself, if you were to like make a cut in a vein and see the blood bleed out, the blood would be red, but it's a property of physics and light scattering that makes it look blue the less oxygenated it is. It's the same reason why the sky looks blue. But this is called cyanosis. So if you see a person who looks blue, like their lips look blue or their fingernails, this is a bad sign. This person needs to go to a hospital immediately. This is called cyanosis. And what that means is that the internal body tissues are not getting the oxygen that they need. And without oxygen, the cells cannot make ATP, and ATP powers everything in the cell. So death can happen quickly, which is one of the problems with the COVID-19 that we're seeing, why they're paying so close attention to people's blood oxygen levels and advising people to go to the hospital immediately if you're having trouble breathing. Now, sometimes you can get a disease that causes your skin to turn yellow, and this is called jaundice. And typically this comes from a problem with the liver. There are lots of different causes. Hepatitis is caused by a virus that can cause a person's liver to make them have jaundice. Sometimes newborn babies are born with jaundice because their liver hasn't fully started functioning yet. People who have cirrhosis of the liver, they can also develop jaundice. Typically, that's a problem that follows from heavy alcohol abuse or heavy drug abuse. But it makes the skin turn yellowish, and it also affects the whites of your eyes. Those turn yellow as well. And this is also a problem, and you do need to go see a doctor about it. For babies, if they're born that way, doctors will monitor them. They usually advise for babies to put them out in the sun, and that'll clear up most of the jaundice. And they monitor the baby's liver function, and typically it kicks in after a few days. Now the dermis, that's our next layer of the skin, main layer. It is a little bit easier in a way. It only has two main layers. It has a papillary layer and then the reticular layer. It is just deep to the epidermis. It binds with it through that basement membrane. But at the very top of the dermis, you have these little bumps all over it, and they're called dermal papillae. That's plural. Papilla is singular. And they do extend upward and kind of push into the dermis or the epidermis. These are what cause fingerprints. Okay, the fingerprints are unique, even amongst identical twins. They're unique. And it's just kind of random how these papillae form. But what's inside this papilla is a little tiny capillary loop, and this is what provides the blood supply to the epidermis. Dermis itself is made of areolar tissue and also some dense connective tissue. There's a lot of collagen in it. There's a lot of elastic fibers in it. Although over time, these fibers are not replaced properly just due to aging, especially the elastin, and that's why the older you get, the more likely you are to have like wrinkles or crepe paper looking skin because these fibers aren't regenerated properly. But in younger skin, this is what gives your skin its toughness and its elasticity. So if you kind of pinch your skin a little bit, I mean, don't pinch so it hurts, but just kind of pinch it and let it go, the skin should snap back easily. And within the dermis, this is also where you're going to find those other accessory organs. So your hair follicles, any nerve endings, nerve fibers, your sweat glands, and also sebaceous glands, which are a type of an oil gland. And we'll talk more about those in an upcoming slide. So again, here's the same picture from before, the layers of the dermis. This is a Meissner's corpuscle. This helps with your sense of touch. I think I've hit on all the other ones of these. A Pacinian corpuscle here. This one's a little bit deeper. So the Meissner's corpuscle is for fine sensation, like if you were feeling, you know, if you could read Braille, the tiny bumps, versus the Pacinian corpuscle is a deeper pressure. So if someone like grabbed your arm, you know, too tightly, you would feel that with the Pacinian corpuscle. Okay. And that concludes the first half of our notes. So I'll provide you with a PowerPoint on your Schoology page and make sure that you finish the notes in the next video.